Chapter 4. Goblins. These creatures are 2 or 3 times the size of a gnome. Their main industry is eating everything except their own excrement, and their secondary industry is making little goblins, which they do at exceptional speed. They are not terribly strong, but are sneaky and cunning, and they have a society similar to the locust. Needless to say, these features do not make them easy to get along with. Dr. Unfriendly's Comprehensive Guide to Everything. The town square, set around an ugly black stone well, was surrounded by a thin but interested line of townspeople. Shiv stood by himself near the center as the baronet made a speech to the village as a whole, seeming not to notice that most of the village was absent. The town's other mercenary groups also stood in the square, separate from the others and from Shiv, more or less at attention, as the baronet more or less congratulated himself at their expense. Shiv looked around at the other groups, especially the Hammerhand brothers, who glared back from time to time. There was also a group of 3 gnomes standing in the shadow of the well, small enough to nearly escape notice. One of them, wearing a black top hat, nodded as he met Shiv's eyes. Lastly, there was a peg-legged blonde hillman with a weirdly shaped bone staff, standing next to a bleary-eyed but muscular brute with huge spiked iron gauntlets, and an extremely short figure in a heavy blue cloak. Shiv nodded his head, thinking. As with most adventurers, they seemed an odd bunch, perhaps not all that impressive in a military sense. Despite that, most adventurers had some special skill or bit of magic which made them deceptively formidable. No doubt the baronet would have traded them all for half the number of mounted knights. The one mounted knight Falsier did still have was nearing 60 years old, and although he sat tall in the saddle, one could see the weight of the plate armor he wore made it difficult. Shiv shook his head slightly. The old veteran would be sweating and exhausted by midday.
"As I have mentioned to you all,"
Falsier droned on, now addressing the mercenaries, who began paying attention to varying degrees.
"Not long ago we received word that a company of goblins ambushed a group of knights headed back from the front lines. Although Redlock is not obviously a high-value target, it would be prudent to be on the lookout for these and other goblins should they approach at our doorstep. I need not remind anyone here what 150 armed goblins would do to our village of 123 people. Goblins are also known to attack by ambush or at night, and I do not wish to face an enemy outnumbered and unprepared. So, I need the area to the north and east scouted thoroughly. Obviously, if you encounter the Goblin Company, you are not expected to attack them. Rather, bring back any information you can so that an attack may be organized with all of the forces at our disposal. In the meanwhile, of course, Sir Mortimer will remain behind, as will Captain Terman's town guards, to ensure our town is still safe. I will see you back here the day after tomorrow. You have all our good wishes, and may the 5 brothers fulfill your needs."
Falsier smiled and motioned several people to follow him. And as the townspeople dispersed, the mercenaries began to strap on backpacks and weapon harnesses. The local priest of the 5 brothers, whose name had escaped Shiv, walked by in silver chainmail and multicolored silk robes, passing each mercenary with an extravagant gesture of blessing. He gave a few extra moments to the Hammerhand brothers, perhaps thinking that the similarity between the 4 half-brothers and their sister and the quintuplet demigods was more than coincidence. Shiv ignored the preacher, straightened the strap of the lyre on his shoulder, and grumbled to himself. This nonsense was delaying the preparations for his show. He'd purchased a temporary pavilion tent for the occasion, and it was already set up just outside of the town walls, while the 2 local carpenters were building simple benches, props, and a stage inside. There was a notice posted at the tent door offering to hire the town's 6 best musicians, and a local young tough was posted to keep curious passers-by out of the tent and in suspense. He shrugged to himself and began to saunter along a side road to the village's gateway, and quickly stopped short, nearly tripping over the little gnome with the top hat. The tiny hat came a handspan short of waist height, and he was significantly taller than his two female companions. As a passing thought, Shiv judged he might be able to pick up either one of the gnome women with a single hand. Dr. Unfriendly, leader of the Wisps of Shadow, pleased to meet you. You are the one they call Shiv, organizing this magic show, are you not? That would be myself, sir. You are actually a doctor of the university? Oh, yes, I am. And thank you for picking up on the title. Most of the locals don't recognize it. I have a well-rounded doctorate in arcana and other mystical pursuits, and am something of an amateur wizard. At any rate, I just wanted to express my relief at the new blood. Last month my brother-in-law Lester was lost in combat with kobolds, and I'd hate to feel we were losing this town through attrition. Good luck! Shiv had no time to reply before the tiny doctor whirled on his heel and scuttled away, looking vaguely like a badly made framework of twigs under a cheap robe. His two partners whirled with him, and they all scuttled off as well, each clutching an iron-shod little staff which could not possibly be of much use in a fight. Still, gnomes were known to be resourceful and tricky, if rather strange, and they had obviously survived in this job for a while. With a quick look around him, Shiv shrugged to himself and walked out of the gate, hands loose, relaxed, and ready to flick knives out of nowhere in the blink of an eye. The Hammerhand brothers took the main road to the north by northeast. Ericstown was a half a day in that direction. And the group with the peg-legged hillman headed southeast into some light forest. The gnomes looked briefly at him and started northeast, more or less directly towards the goblin battle lines. Shiv watched them all for a few seconds and then headed due east into an area of heavier forest and rocky hills. The area was pleasant enough, although Nesland was known for rain in general. This particular area was fairly dry, and it was a sunny day in early autumn with the leaves just getting a thin edge of rust. He reached the top of the first hill in only a few minutes. He stopped and judged the village was just out of bowshot at this range. And then he started down the opposite slope into a loose area of woods. He found an area to enter with not too much underbrush and quietly stalked in. Under the trees, the breeze was virtually gone, and the sunlight came down in thin beams. Birds of a dozen descriptions sung loudly, and occasionally in the distance, bushes rustled or a twig snapped. With the lack of a path and the rough ground, progress was slow but uneventful. The border of the official wilderness was supposed to be 3 leagues away, so no doubt Shiv would be right around the border when he stopped for the night. He planned to cover the area around his campsite for a day or so, depending upon the layout, and then head back by a different route. If the baronet wanted a more detailed search than that, perhaps he'd hired the wrong person for the job. It wasn't long before he stepped out into an odd clearing. It looked to be a circle perhaps 100 paces across, where all the undergrowth had been trimmed down to knee height. In the center of the circle was a lone hill with a single dead tree growing up out of it. Shiv frowned to himself. This was most peculiar. Why would anyone keep a random area clear of brush was anyone's guess. He noticed a variety of trees from the area had also been cleared, and the long dry woods circled the clearing in neat stacks. So, why was the one dead tree still standing when the rest had been cut down? He told himself, or he'd been told once, that when something didn't make sense, magic was often involved. While there seemed to be no wizards or standing stones or anything about, it was a definite possibility. With that, he sat down cross-legged and took out one of his silver daggers. Humming quietly to himself, he pricked the end of his finger and squeezed a single drop of blood onto the flat of the blade. And then, balancing the blade on an uninjured finger, he let the weapon slowly spin in place. After a few moments, he noticed a glimmer in the droplet of blood. Every time the red speck was between him and the hill, the light flickered. It was a trick he'd learned from a bladesmith in the far-off council towers. Something about the nature of light he, quite frankly, didn't understand. But it meant there was magic there. A spell someone had cast on that spot years ago, perhaps. Or maybe it was a grave of the fairies or something. He had no idea. He wasn't a wizard, but there was something there. He climbed to his feet, wiping the dagger on the grass in the process, and then spun it lightly before it disappeared into the hiding spot near his armpit. And then, warily, he approached the hill. Nothing appeared to bar his way, and in a moment he was standing on the hilltop next to the tree. He paused, looking around for some weird spirit creature or a mystical glow, but there was nothing. He slumped a bit, relieved, and leaned up against the tree. And fell through. The tree wasn't there. It looked like it was, but his hands passed through it with no resistance. Feeling on the ground, there was a hole several inches underneath the projection, and inside, perhaps, tangled roots? He pulled his hand out of the illusion, and the palm was covered in black dust. He brushed the dry dust off, and it came off fairly easily, seeming like ashes or soot. Curious. He felt around briefly, but found no other illusions, just the tree that wasn't there. Well, whoever had wanted a fake tree did not appear to be around or casting spells on him or anything, so he made a mental note of the location and continued on east out of the clearing and back into the woods. Apparently, wizards had nothing better to do than waste his time. He passed a small fenced-in graveyard. The sign over the entrance gave the imaginative name Redlock Graveyard, which he stayed the hell out of. And he passed a small stream where he took a drink and refilled his nearly full water skin. He was on top of another hill when the clouds began to gather. At the top of the hill was a thick knot of woods with a heavy canopy of leaves. The wind did not seem to penetrate it, neither did the sunlight, and there were no birds singing in those branches. The sun came out from behind the clouds. As he watched the shadows play around the area, he noticed the afternoon sunlight did not even touch the thicket. No matter how the clouds arranged themselves, there was always one between that patch of trees and the sun. He frowned and took a drink. This area was getting stranger the more he explored. Sighing, he sat down, pricked a second finger, and once again began doing his magic detecting test. The blade spun for a few seconds before it started to tremor and vibrate. He could see that despite the spinning, and then, while pointing at the woods, there was a tiny pop, and the spot of blood vaporized. He leapt to his feet and stared at the dagger blade. The speck of black where the blood had been was burned into the metal. Shiv cleared his throat and decided that whatever was in that thicket, it probably deserved some privacy. He'd report the thicket, but if they wanted it explored, well, they could send the Hammerhand brothers. He stowed the marked dagger with a flourish, adjusted his hat, and continued east.